Here's a gentle yet thought-provoking hook for the start of your speech. In the tone inspired by Mr. Rogers, have you ever wondered what happens when a country is split in two, not just by borders, but by fear, by war, and by the choices of others? The story of the Korean War isn't just about soldiers and battles. It's about families separated, dreams interrupted, and a people who held on to hope when the world around them was falling apart. Asterisk, sometimes history brings US stories that are hard, stories that carry pain and struggle. The Korean War is one of those stories, a story that reminds us how precious peace is, and how strong the human spirit can be, even in the darkest times. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful country called Korea. After a great world war, Korea found itself divided, not because the people wanted it, but because powerful nations made decisions far away. One side in the north, the other in the south. They were still one people, but they were no longer one country. Then came a day in 1950, when early in the morning, North Korean soldiers crossed a line called the 38th parallel. It was the beginning of something terrible. The South was caught by surprise, families were torn apart, homes were destroyed. The world watched, and some nations came to help. Soldiers came from far away, many of them, young and afraid, but they believed they were helping to protect freedom. The fighting went back and forth, so much pain, so much loss. Cities were burned, children cried, people ran from their homes. But even in all the sadness, there were moments of kindness, people helping one another. Soldiers carrying wounded children, nurses comforting strangers. After 3 years, the guns finally stopped. They signed an armistice, not peace, but a pause. The war never officially ended, and the two Koreas still stand apart, facing each other across a line of silence. But the story doesn't end in sadness. South Korea rose again. People worked hard, dreamed big, and built a nation full of hope and strength. From ashes and sorrow, they made something beautiful. History teaches us that war is never the answer we hope for, but it also shows us that kindness, courage, and the will to move forward are stronger than any weapon. And that's something worth remembering today and always. After World War II ended in 1945, Korea, which had been under Japanese rule for decades, was suddenly left without a government. The Allied powers agreed to divide the Korean Peninsula temporarily at the 38th parallel as a way to manage the transition. The Soviet Union would occupy the north, while the United States would take control of the south. This division was intended to be short-term until Korea could be unified under a new independent government. However, the Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly turned this temporary line into a permanent divide. In the north, the Soviets helped establish a communist regime led by Kim Il-sung, while in the south, the United States supported a democratic government under Syngman Rhee. Both leaders claimed to be the rightful ruler of all Korea, refusing to recognize each other's governments. Efforts to hold free elections across the entire peninsula failed as each side fortified its control. The two Koreas developed different political systems, economies, and ideologies. The border between them became increasingly tense, with frequent skirmishes and hostilities. As the Cold War deepened globally, Korea became a flashpoint between communist and capitalist forces. Both the Soviet Union and the United States continued to support their respective sides with military advisors and weapons. By the late 1940s, it was clear that reunification through peaceful means was unlikely. The division of Korea laid the foundation for future conflict, as both governments prepared for the possibility of war. The Korean people, who had once shared language, culture, and history, were now caught in a geopolitical struggle that was not of their own making. The 38th parallel, once an arbitrary line on a map, became a symbol of the deepening divide, not only within Korea, but between two competing world powers. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces launched a surprise attack across the 38th parallel, initiating a full-scale invasion of South Korea. The North Korean army, well equipped and trained by Soviet advisors, advanced rapidly. capturing key cities including the capital, Seoul, within just a few days. South Korean forces, caught off guard and poorly prepared, were quickly overwhelmed. As North Korean troops pushed further south, the United Nations Security Council, led by the United States, condemned the invasion and called for international military support to repel the aggression. President Harry Truman authorized the deployment of U.S. forces to Korea, marking the beginning of direct American involvement. Under the UN flag, a coalition of nations, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and others, joined the effort. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed commander of the United Nations forces. Despite the support, the early weeks were marked by setbacks. The South Korean and UN troops were pushed into a small corner in the southeast, known as the Pusan Perimeter. There, they made a determined stand against the North's offensive. In September 1950, MacArthur launched a bold counterattack with an amphibious landing at Inchon, a port city near Seoul. This maneuver caught the North Koreans by surprise and turned the tide of the war. UN forces recaptured Seoul and began pushing the North Korean army back across the 38th parallel. As they advanced further into North Korea, they approached the Yalu River, which borders China. Alarmed by the UN advance, China entered the war, with hundreds of thousands of troops, drastically shifting the balance again. The war escalated into a brutal, grinding conflict with massive casualties on both sides. The early invasion by North Korea and the swift international response transformed what began as a civil conflict into a major global confrontation during the Cold War. The Korean War brought with it an immense human cost, deeply affecting millions of lives across both North and South Korea. Civilians bore the brunt of the conflict as entire towns and villages were bombed, burned, and abandoned. Families were torn apart as people fled their homes to escape advancing armies, often leaving behind everything they owned. Some were separated permanently from loved ones who ended up on the opposite side of the divided peninsula. The scale of the destruction was staggering. Over 3 million Koreans died, and millions more were wounded or displaced. The death toll included not only soldiers but a vast number of innocent civilians, many of whom were caught in crossfire or targeted in attacks on towns and refugee convoys. As fighting raged, both sides committed atrocities, and the fog of war made it difficult to distinguish between combatants and civilians in many situations. In addition to the Korean casualties, the war also claimed the lives of around 40,000 American soldiers, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. China, which intervened in support of North Korea, also suffered heavy losses. The United States conducted widespread bombing campaigns in North Korea, devastating nearly every major city and industrial center, causing further civilian suffering. Entire regions were reduced to rubble, leaving survivors without shelter, food, or medicine. Refugee camps became overcrowded, and diseases spread quickly among displaced populations. The psychological trauma left behind was equally profound. Children grew up amid chaos. Soldiers returned home scarred by what they had witnessed, and generations lived with the memory of devastation. The war's violence and unpredictability affected every aspect of life, from families to schools to temples and farms. The cost was not just counted in numbers, but in broken communities, lost childhoods, and the long road to healing that would take many years to begin. As the Korean War continued into late 1951, the front lines stabilized near the 38th parallel, the very line that had originally divided North and South Korea. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage despite intense fighting and heavy casualties. With the war at a bloody standstill, both sides began negotiations to end the conflict. These armistice talks started in July 1951 in the town of Kaesong, and later moved to Panmunjom. However, the negotiations dragged on for 2 years due to disagreements on key issues. One of the main points of contention was the repatriation of prisoners of war. The United Nations, led by the United States, insisted on voluntary repatriation, allowing prisoners to choose whether they wanted to return to their home country. North Korea and China demanded that all prisoners be returned regardless of their wishes. This issue became symbolic of the larger ideological struggle between democracy and communism, and it caused long delays. Meanwhile, the fighting did not stop. Both sides launched offensives and counteroffensives, often for control of small hills and outposts. The war took on a trench-like nature, resembling the static warfare of World War I, with soldiers enduring harsh conditions and continuous shelling. The civilian population continued to suffer during this prolonged phase of the war. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice agreement was signed. It created a demilitarized zone (DMZ) that ran along the front lines near the 38th parallel, stretching roughly 250 kilometers across the peninsula. Both sides agreed to cease hostilities and maintain the separation, but no formal peace treaty was ever signed. The armistice was meant to be temporary, yet it has remained in place for decades. Though the guns fell silent, the conflict left the Korean Peninsula divided, its people grieving, and the world watching a fragile peace held by barbed wire and guarded silence. Asterisk, the Korean War did not end with a peace treaty, only with an armistice, meaning that technically, North and South Korea have remained in a state of war ever since. 1953, the Armistice Agreement established a demilitarized zone, DMZ, that serves as a buffer between the two Koreas. This strip of land, about 4 kilometers wide and stretching 250 kilometers across the peninsula, is heavily fortified on both sides with barbed wire, landmines, watchtowers, and armed guards. Despite its name, the DMZ is one of the most militarized areas in the world. Both North and South Korea maintain large standing armies, and over the years, the zone has been the site of numerous skirmishes, infiltration attempts, and tense standoffs. The division of the peninsula has had deep consequences for the Korean people. Families separated by the war were never able to reunite, with many dying without ever seeing their loved ones again. Occasional reunions have been organized through diplomatic agreements, but they are rare, emotionally intense, and highly restricted. The division has also created two very different nations. North Korea became a closed authoritarian state under the Kim dynasty, isolated from most of the world and focused heavily on military power. South Korea, on the other hand, followed a path of economic development and democratization, eventually becoming one of the world's leading economies. The contrast between the two Koreas is stark visible from space in the form of city lights, with the south brightly illuminated and the north mostly dark. The DMZ remains a powerful symbol of the unresolved conflict. Though the Korean people share language, history, and cultural roots, they live under vastly different systems. The continued division reflects the long shadow cast by the war and the deep scars left on a nation once whole. Now split by ideology and barbed wire. After the devastation of the Korean War, South Korea faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding a shattered nation. Cities lay in ruins, the economy was nearly non-existent, and millions of people had lost their homes and families. Despite these hardships, the people of South Korea showed remarkable determination to rise from the ruins. In the years following the war, the country relied heavily on international aid, particularly from the United States, to support reconstruction. But beyond foreign assistance, it was the resilience and work ethic of the South Korean people that drove the nation forward. Through land reforms, investment in education, and strong government-led economic planning, South Korea slowly began to transform. During the 1960s and 1970s, the country entered a period of rapid industrialization, known as the Miracle on the Han River. Factories were built, infrastructure expanded, and exports increased. South Korea moved from a primarily agricultural society to a thriving industrial economy in just a few decades. Alongside economic growth came political changes. Though the early post-war years were marked by authoritarian rule, public demand for democracy grew stronger. Massive protests and political movements led to democratic reforms in the late 1980s. And South Korea held its first truly free presidential election in 1987. Over time, South Korea became known for its technological innovation, cultural influence, and global engagement. It joined international organizations, hosted major events like the Olympics, and became a hub for music, film, and fashion through what is now called the Korean Wave. Behind all this progress was the memory of war, constant reminder of what had been lost and what had been endured. The journey from ruins to prosperity was not easy, but it reflected the spirit of a people who refused to be defined by conflict and instead built a future filled with hope, strength, and purpose. Asterisk here is the conclusion of the entire speech in the gentle, heartfelt style you've been using. So, when we look back at the story of the Korean War, we see more than battles and borders. We see a people divided, a land scarred by conflict, and hearts broken by loss. But we also see courage. We see the will to rebuild, the strength to rise again, and the hope that someday a divided family might be made whole. South Korea's journey from war-torn ruins to a shining example of resilience reminds us that even after the darkest nights, the sun can rise again. History teaches us hard lessons, but it also shows us the power of healing, the beauty of peace, and the importance of remembering so that we can build a kinder, stronger world for those who come after us.